Hello, and welcome to CoPA Conversations. I'm Keller Coker, Dean of the School of Jazz and Contemporary Music at the College of Performing Arts at the New School, and have the privilege of moderating today's discussion featuring our two very esteemed guests, Hank Shocklee and Timo Andrus. Thank you both for being here today, and thank you all for joining us here today. By way of introduction, Hank Shocklee is a 2013 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee and a 2018 Grammy Hall of Fame inductee as a founder and producer of the seminal hip-hop group Public Enemy and the Bomb Squad. He is a former senior vice president of the Black Music Division for MCA Universal Records and current owner of the New York City-based production company Shocklee Entertainment. Hank is a music producer, sound designer, DJ, and all-around musical disruptive innovator. Hank is also a faculty member at the School of Jazz and Contemporary Music at the New School. Timo is a composer and pianist whose notable works include Everything Happens So Much for the Boston Symphony, Strong Language for the Takash Quartet, commissioned by Carnegie Hall and the Schreiber Hall concert series, and The Blind Banister, a concerto for Jonathan Biss, which was a 2016 Pulitzer Prize finalist. As a pianist, Timo has appeared with the Los Angeles Philharmonic, North Carolina Symphony, the Albany Symphony, and the New World Symphony. Among his many collaborators are Becca Stevens, Brad Meldau, the Kronos Quartet, John Adams, Philip Glass, and Sufjan Stevens. Let's see, 3 out of those 5 are New School alums. So those are great collaborators. Timo is also a None Such Records artist and a faculty member of the Mannes School of Music. Thank you again, both of you, so much for being here today.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. What a great intro.
Yes. So hey, let's get started with this. What were the important events or influences that propelled each of you on your musical journey?
Wow. Timo, you want to go or you want me to go? It doesn't matter, I'll go.
You go.
Okay. You know something, I started out as a record collector. I've been collecting records since I was 5 years old. My father had an incredible jazz library of records. So I had to listen to every jazz artist you can possibly imagine. And so I grew up with kind of like jazz in the background, but I was always inspired by, funk, R&B, those type of sounds. Also, I got into a little bit of rock and roll, alternative, psychedelic, all kinds of, different types of music. I'm a fan of classical as well. I worked at a record shop, and I kind of like, from there, I just kind of like became a DJ. And then from becoming a DJ, it kind of like taught me a lot about how people react to music. What type of music do they like? And all different types of, whether you're doing something at a wedding reception or you're doing something at a club. So it taught me what people's ears for listening to. I always wanted to be in a band, but because I didn't have anybody that wanted to play with me, that's why I picked up the turntable. And it led me to finding Chuck. We were both at Adelphi University at the radio station, and I saw him, and we developed a bond, and from there we started producing demos and things that would later become the Public Enemy records, and from there, we teamed up with Rick Rubin and Russell Simmons, and the rest was, to me, the rest was just history, if you want to call it that.
That's interesting. I mean, I feel that I also started with records. I mean, I have strong memories of, sitting on the floor in front of my dad's stereo and listening to tapes, listening to records. The music he had was mainly classical, actually. Beethoven, Mozart, the Leonard Bernstein Children's Favorites album that I think, is formative for any classical musician. But he also had some folk music, Pete Seeger records, Simon and Garfunkel, um, some other stuff like that. And I just remember sitting there and saying like, I want to know how they did that. I want to know how they made that particular sound or that particular harmony, though I didn't know the word harmony at that time. But there was always sort of this drive to figure out like, oh, that sound, like what went into that? Like, how do I do that? Like, how do I make my own thing out of that? A very kind of acquisitive impulse, I guess, when I think about it now. But I think, composers are acquisitive. We hear something and we want to somehow possess it or create something like it. And I just that's still sort of how I feel.
Nice.
Isn't it something, the disappearance of record stores, and then it's the reemergence of vinyl, and where so many great artists came out of that amazing vinyl experience. I mean, in a way, we had that control over what we were listening to, and we started it with that needle, collaborating with vinyl in a way, and which maybe leads me to the next step here with this discussion. Now, both of you are heavy collaborators. The people that you've worked with, and the various ways that processes that you've engaged in those collaborations. I think everybody would love to hear about those experiences and how you approach collaboration in your work.
It's a great question. The thing for me about collaboration is this: it's kind of like, and from my experience, it's always been a perspective of trying to psychoanalyze the artist or the or whoever you're collaborating with. It's because you have to know their tendencies. For me, it's all about, like, if you're a drummer, for example, like, what's your strong points in being a drummer? Are you good at doing, fills? Are you good at holding a steady beat? Those are things that people take for granted. But when you put someone in a studio environment and you put a click to them, all of a sudden things change. Then you find out that they're not as steady on the beat. Maybe they're doing too many rolls, and so each artist or musician or whoever that you work with, you want to find out what their tendencies are, what their strengths are, and what their weaknesses are. And for me, my job is to be able to highlight the strengths and kind of like eliminate or hide their weaknesses.
That's so interesting, because I feel, when I've done work in the studio, it's mostly in more of a classical sense, where a producer is a very different thing. But I feel that there's some element there that's the same, that the producers I've worked with who I like the best are the ones who kind of figure out how to draw the best performance out of me. And they figure out how I play, what my strengths are, even just how I respond to the given situation or the time of day, or like, where we are in the session. And they know what to say or do, or how to approach something in order to get me to play my best, which I feel like is a little bit what you were saying.
Yeah, that it's funny, because I have a lot to say, and part of my problem is that people, I tend to say too much. So I try to approach it in a natural. I want the environment to be natural, first of all. I remember, I can go back and when we was doing Fight the Power, and I wanted to have Branford Marsalis come in and play sax on the record, and the record was like, the record was a hip hop record, And you know, and it's, I mean, the straight. This is like something, and he's never heard this before, and I don't think that anybody has ever asked him to play on something like that. And it was so, and the material was so dense. He was trying to figure out, like, well, where can he get in? And so
Right.
he was playing very shy, very cautious. And so you know, I stopped the session. I said, I went and talked to him. I said, you know something, I don't want you to play like you understand what music is. I want you to play like you're 14 years old and you just picked up this instrument for the first time and you don't know what it is, and you're hearing this sound that's there, and I just want you to interact with it. All I want him to do was have a conversation with this, but I want an aggressive conversation. And then from that point, that's when he kind of like loosened up and then realized, oh, okay, now I could just relax and I can let all the training, so to speak, kind of like fall to the side.
I mean, that to me is like that much more sort of active type of production of use of the studio is like, that's when a producer and a composer kind of become one and the same. Because that's the type of idea that reminds me of something that I would sit down and say, like, oh, what kind of a thing am I going to do in this piece? Like, what are the big building blocks? How are they going to interact? You know, if there's more than one musician, like, how are the different musicians going to interact with each other? That is exactly the type of question that I would ask myself, is like, I just started a piece yesterday, cello and piano, so two musicians. And so one of the big first questions that you have to ask yourself is like, okay, what's the dynamic between these two instrumentalists, these two people, you know? And that's so interesting that that stage of the process can happen writing notes on paper, but also like interacting with sound physically in the studio.
Interesting. You know, it's I try to look at music from a perspective of what does it look like? Because to me, sound has a look to it, as well as it has as a sound. Because I try to approach it from a very visual perspective. And also emotional. So because I think that the thing that when you're making a record, you know, the thing that you have to have is the emotion, because without the emotion, it's just a piece of music that has no connection with anyone. It's how you interact with it, with your instrument, or how you interact with the piece that's there, and what are you trying to convey? What message are you trying to convey? And that to me is how I look at music. You know, like, I'm not a big fan of music that doesn't have a message. And that message can be that it has no message. But it has to send out some sort of messaging to people so that they can interact with it as well.
It has to be an equation where there's a listener on one side and a musician on the other. That it's a two-way. I'm so interested in this idea of thinking of music as visual. I mean, I kind of want you to say more about that. Like, what does it look like in your head? Like, if you think of a piece of music or a sound or a track, like, what is it that you're seeing? Is it like colors, or is it like a Pro Tools session, or like what does it look like?
Yeah, that's funny, because, you know, music and light has a lot in common. It's everything is based off of temperature. You know, so I look at, so when I see music, I see colors, first of all. And then what I want to know is, like, what are the tones like? For example, is this track has a lot of what I consider to be fall colors? Is a lot of browns and blacks, and then some yellows that's mixed in there? Or is it full spectrum? You know, it's got blue, amber, red. It's got a lot of, you know, those two things convey totally different ideas, totally different emotions. You know, something that's full spectrum to me is a lot brighter, is a lot happier in terms of frequency. You know, something that has more bottom end to it becomes darker. So those are the things that, and then you want to listen to like the aggressiveness. Is it aggressive, or is it tender or soft, so to speak? So I mean that's
so interesting.
That's the overall idea.
I guess I do associate keys or like tonalities with different colors, like or hot or cool spectrum, if you want to talk about temperature. And I find it's something I find myself thinking about lately because you know, in the absence of live performing, I've been making all these videos of myself just sitting here right where I am. I'm actually at my piano. I'm making all these home videos of me playing various all kinds of repertoire. And part of that is like I'm doing lighting. And I always like, for when I have a live concert, you know, sometimes they'll send the lighting person up and say like, oh, how do you want the lighting to be for this show? And I've never really given it much thought. I'm always just like, oh, you know, something pretty undistracting, or, you know, something just to draw the focus. And now I'm kind of thinking like, oh, actually, how do I see the lighting for this particular music interact, like the sound and the light interacting in terms of color and temperature and directionality. And it is kind of giving me all these different ideas. It's like this whole angle that I just haven't explored before.
Wow. Yeah. Gosh. I mean, there's so much we could talk about this. We can take this into infinity. I guess I want to ask you, Timo, is how, you know, as a musician, what is it like, you know, like when you're working with someone and someone is directing you or you're collaborating with them? How is that interaction on your side? What is it like? Is for example, you know, one of the things is I'm not on that side a lot because I'm not like a musician that goes in and plays for people, but you know, but as doing film scoring, you have to work with a director, and then you're on that other side of it. And so I find that a lot of directors, you know, are giving you music. I mean, giving you cues, but their cues are like, it needs more energy. It needs to be brighter, you know. And you're sitting there going like, well, how do you manifest that, you know, and get the best and get them what they want when they're not really giving you that energy to direction?
Well, I mean, music is kind of famously one of the hardest things to put into words, right? And it's like their words are going to be totally different from your words. And your words are going to be totally different, again, from my words. And maybe we've just sort of developed a personal vocabulary, or maybe it's, you know, in part due to kind of the musical worlds that we come from and work in. But the more kind of different worlds that I find myself in, the more I realize like, oh, we're all kind of talking about the same subset of ideas in terms of how to describe music, but we just have different words for them. That was something when I was working on the record with Sufjan Stevens and working on playing his music and orchestrating his music. That was something that I really found to be true, was like, he is someone who doesn't necessarily come from a background of like classical music, orchestral music, chamber music. And so I wish I could remember some examples, but he'd have these funny words in the music that he gave me that just like seemed kind of crazy at first. And I was just like, Sufjan, what do you mean by, you know, I remember there's one spot he said, like a teenager. You play this part like a teenager. And I was just like, that's not an indication I've ever even seen in music before. Um, and I don't even remember what it ended up meaning, but it ended up meaning something actually quite musically uh, basic. Like it was something that we probably have like a standard Italian word for that like we composers would use or whatever. But you know, it depends very much on which side of the equation I'm on, and I find myself on all different sides. Like sometimes I'm a composer directing instrumentalists, how to play my music. Sometimes I'm an instrumentalist receiving direction from a composer on their music. Sometimes, I'm, yeah, as you said, like recording for films or for I've even done a little commercial music or, um, doing something very collaborative, like layering a track on someone's album. Um, and yeah, I find it really educational to be able to kind of operate at those various different levels of authority, I guess. Um, and in some positions, you kind of have the final say over how everything goes, like everything from how it's recorded and how it sounds in the studio to how the instrumentalists and singers perform their parts. And sometimes it's much more of a humble role, and you're just, as you said, trying to kind of respond to a piece of music that's already there and like fill in your role and add something but not be sort of the most obtrusive voice, not be the loudest voice in the room. um, so I gain a great deal of insight and energy into all of those different ways of working. It's something actually I really like about sort of the musical life I've stumbled on for myself.
Awesome.
I wonder if I could just slightly shift direction because it feels like we're heading in this way anyway. But both of you are have such amazing imaginations, and your creativity manifests itself in your work just so clearly and to the audience. And so where what role does experimentation and being on the front edge of creating something new, what role does that play for each of you in your process, and how does it manifest in your work?
I mean, an experiment is it's funny because there's like a whole genre of music, so-called experimental music, which I always thought was kind of a funny term. Like, do they do they figure out if the experiment worked afterwards? Like, what was the hypothesis? It's so funny because music to me is not really like, I don't really go in and trying to prove something or I don't know. I find that most of what drives me outside of my comfort zone or outside of the sort of areas I've worked in before is external. It's, collaboration, working with someone or in some context that kind of forces me outside of the strictures of what I've done before. And so it'll often just be that I have to try something new by necessity of the commission or the gig or the job or whatever it is. And I always kind of jump at those chances if it's something that I haven't really done before. I mean, it makes me nervous, makes me scared as hell sometimes. I mean, to go outside of your comfort zone, but I always find it rewarding, and I always find it that I end up with some new tool that I can add to my toolbox and use down the road. And I'm just kind of trying to grow this tool, this set of tools that I have at my disposal. to hopefully become a more, um, more broad-minded, more knowledgeable, more skilled at different things as a musician.
Wow. Yeah, I guess you for me it's more of experimentation is everything to me. It's it's the world in which I live. Like for example, just before I got on today, I'm experimenting with taking analog sound and bringing it back into the computer. And what I mean by that is I'm recording onto a cassette and then recording it back into the computer. Because one of the things that when I started, the reason why I love the sample is because I like the way natural instruments sound in natural spaces. And when you're in the computer world now, you're devoid of that. So you're basically taking an inorganic material and putting it in an inorganic space. And so it's kind of like so now you have to give it life. And how do you give it life? I did massive amounts of experiments in the digital realm versus the analog realm, just to get an understanding of why is it when I listen to digital music, something that's completely digital, is that I can only listen to it for a few minutes. But if I'm listening to something on a cassette or I'm listening to an album, I'm devoid of time. I'm not even looking at time when I'm listening to those mediums. So that's the thing that my quest and my search for is because I want to create an environment for listeners now that's completely organic, even though that I'm using digital means.
That's so fascinating. I mean, it reminds me of kind of this idea that the medium is the message, or at least part of the message. I mean, I find that, some music that is very digital and very clean and very, very much in the box, it brings with it a set of emotional attachments, that it's, and I don't know, I mean, those are they're impossible to separate from like our cultural associations with computers and with technology and with the internet and all sorts of things. That digital music sounds digital, and that has its own set of baggage. And it's so funny because like it's so easy in a certain sense to make music now. It's like anyone has you can do it with your phone, anyone has the tools. And yet it is the human element that we look for, that we keep coming back to. I was just reminded of this the other day. I was like cleaning up a recording of some friends, and one of them is a flute player. So I was sort of mixing this track. I have the technology now to take out all of the breath sounds, where she has to breathe. And sometimes wind players have to be very careful about where they breathe so they don't interrupt the flow of the music and breathe in the right place. But then sometimes I found I would take out what I thought would be an intrusive breath, and suddenly it would sound completely unnatural. Like it would sound like suddenly this music was being played by a robot. And it's like we forget that, this idea that it's a living, breathing organism that's playing this music, like everything that's associated with that is part of the music, not just the notes.
It's funny that because that to me echoes the fact that what makes music amazing is its imperfections. I think. Mm-hmm. I think that when anything is perfect, it's boring. if you listen to, like, I love to listen to the funk records, you know, from the 70s, you know, late 60s to like mid 70s. To me was like the best period. But the records, if you, from a technical perspective, those records were mixed horribly. I mean, you would hear you would hear like a guitar like dominating the whole track. The drummer would be there, but you wouldn't hear any kick drum. The bass would be in there, but all the high end is rolled off. You know, the singer is singing on top of it, and you really can't hear the presence of them because they're drowned in all this reverb. So, but there's something that was cool about it. Something that grabbed you.
Was it like a school of production that was predominant in that type of music, or was it just like people actually didn't know what they were supposed to be doing?
Well, I think that personally, I think that what they were going for, and this is just, you know, just talking, you know, is the fact that they wanted a vibe. And I think that if you know, I got a chance to be around some of the, you know, the older greats, you know, of music, and I'm always asking them questions like, so what was it like, you know, when you guys were in the studio and you're working, and they all had this very similar takes on it, and it's all centered around the vibe. So they even know that they're prepared with the script. They all know what they want to do and what they want to get accomplished. But how they got there was totally random, and it all based itself on like, yo, is the groove happening? Because you can have musicians that are not playing in key, drummers that are offbeat, singers that are slightly detuned. But you know something? If the vibe is right, then it works. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what that X factor is. Like, what is it? And for me, it resonates as a chill that you get, because you don't know what you don't know what it is. It's kind of chaotic.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm reminded of you know, it's something I tell my students a lot, that you know, sometimes the way that you think of something original, or that you stumble on something original, is you set out to imitate something, or you set out to create a certain kind of a thing, and you fail. And in the process, you accidentally created something new. You created your own sound.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because a lot of, you know, a lot of newbies, if you would, students and people of that nature, is they tend to be rigid to their ideas. Mm-hmm. The ideas, and to me, the studio is a place, yeah, you have to have a plan, otherwise you get nothing done. But you can't be so rigidly holding on to that idea, because you have to kind of like be able to feel which way the wind is blowing. And then you can kind of like ride that, because the idea is you always want the wind at your back and not in your face, right? Because mm-hmm. you want the session to go by easy. Because if it goes down easy, then more than likely that's going to resonate with everybody. I think that what you don't want is that unwanted dissonance that happens when people are not vibing on the same frequency, so to speak.
And sometimes that can result from just like wanting to stick strictly to a plan that you maybe should have abandoned.
Yeah.
I find that to be true. I mean, again, like I feel like in the studio, it's probably, you know, it's more important because there so many people's time and money and all sorts of things. But it's something that, yeah, again, that I talk about with my students, because we always need a plan going into a new piece. I mean, you can't just sort of take a blank piece of paper and just write whatever and, you know, expect to get a piece out of it. You've got to have some sort of plan for what you want to accomplish in a piece. And I think for a long time in the composition world, there was sort of vogue for the plan basically being the piece, and that every parameter of the piece would be a result of this beautiful and intricate plan that you had developed before even sitting down and writing a note. And now I think that the rules are those kind of rules are basically out the window. I mean, you can really do whatever, but there is sometimes still, and I find this to be the case with my own work too, is like I'll set up some sort of process or some sort of idea for how I want the music to be structured or progress in time. And eventually that will lead to a result that just doesn't sound good. And I'll reach this point, and this happens in almost every piece. I'll reach a point where I have to say, like, okay, time to throw out the plan. Like, you're on your own now. It has to be to go with the gut a little.
It's funny. It's funny because you said it doesn't sound good, and for me, it's gonna sound crazy, but I don't listen when I'm in the studio.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not trying to listen because I think listening is where we get crossed up. What I want to do is feel, because I trust my feelings more than I trust my listening ability.
What is how do you define that difference, I guess?
Okay, for example, you could be playing a classical, piece, right? And you could be playing it like you could play it really sterile and stiff and give it no energy, and it'll make people just sit there and go to sleep or do something, or you can play it to the point where people are really, really engaged in it. How does the audience know those differences? And that to me is how I approach it. Is because I don't care about how it's being presented. I'm concerned about how it's being received, because that's more important than how it's being presented. And a lot of people are so concerned with the presentation that they forget about how it's being perceived.
Mm.
And the audience is always, to me, 5 steps ahead of us. So I want to make sure that I'm listening from their perspective and not from my own. Because for me, I could take anything.
I think that's such a beautiful idea. It's such an important thing to keep in mind as, I mean, really any sort of performer, but I think especially as composers or producers or people who write music, is to always have that high respect, that high level of respect for your listener, for your audience. And, I think as audience members, we know when we're being spoken down to, conversely, and it's the worst feeling. It's like, oh, who does this guy think he is? That's like the feeling I get.
It's kind of like Fast and the Furious Part 10.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are the things that I try to look at, and I always want to be sincere. Whatever it is, I want to make sure that it comes across innocently. Because I think that a great piece of music, just like a great piece of art or literature or anything else, it's its sincerity that also wins, if you would. Because in this day and age, anybody can make music with anything. You can make music on your phone now. So now the question is that thing that you're making on your phone can last when it's being projected out in the public, can last the test of time. And
how do you? Yeah, that's an interesting thing to say. I mean, how do you approach that in your work? I'm curious, like this idea of how are people going to hear this in 10 years and 25 years and 50 years? Do you think that far ahead, or is that useful?
No, it's not as conscious as that. For me, it's more like I don't care what's going on right now. I don't care what's going on yesterday. I only care about the possibilities of what can happen for the future. So with that in mind, as a backdrop, you're now looking at things from a little bit of a different perspective. So you're not trying to satisfy any particular time frame other than the music itself. So you're letting the music talk to you and let the music tell you what it wants to be. Because if you listen closely enough, it'll speak to you. If you listen, I'm quite sure if you listen to your performances that you play, you can tell whether you were in it or whether you was just like kind of like you was just getting through it.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely.
Okay. And I want to experiment in that area of being in it. Being
That's
in that, I call it being a
yeah. I mean, it's such a hard thing. I mean, so I mean, obviously, I haven't performed much for the past 6 months. I had one live performance last month in an outdoor venue, and I hadn't performed in months and months, and I found it so difficult. It was not that it was. I found it difficult to play the music, to play the notes, but I just found the concentration of getting into it to be very difficult. And it's because I hadn't practiced that level of conversation in a long time. And it's something that I find to be true in the studio too. It's like the second someone hits that record button, you start to play differently. And that can be true if I'm recording myself alone in my house. And it can be true if I'm, in a high pressure recording situation with a ton of musicians in a fancy studio. It doesn't matter. There's something about that situation that changes my playing, and it's something that I'm really trying to work hard on working through, because I am convinced that the best that I ever play is when I'm at home by myself in my living room on my own piano, just all by myself, no one's listening.
Okay.
And how do I get that level of freedom and relaxation and yes, even experimentation to try playing things in different ways, that feeling of freedom. How do I bring that into my performances when there's an audience? And I'm thinking about all the people who might be in the audience, or when I'm recording and I'm thinking like, oh, gotta get it this take. Like, it's such a tough thing, and I'm not even sure it's 100% possible, but I'm working on it.
Well, that reminds me of when PE Public Enemy first started. They did, and Chuck and them did their first set of shows, out in the public. And no one knew who they were or anything. And no one, and Chuck didn't even know how to work the stage or any of this stuff. What happened was, what Chuck would do was he would turn his back to the audience and do the whole show with his back turned to the audience. And it was crazy. Because at the end, I get all the phone calls and everything else. Why is he turning? He's not engaging in the audience. But that's what it took for him to get into it. And then later, he started slowly but surely turning around. So now it was kind of like him dealing with the energy of dealing with a lot of people's energy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a totally different thing. And this is a thing that makes, a lot of great musicians and artists go into drugs, because they don't want to deal with that intimateness, that closeness of the energy of the audience discovering like who they really are. And so there's a thing that you have to kind of like, you have to distance yourself from them, but at the same time, not distance yourself to the point where you're on an island by yourself. And how do you manage that is how, to me, is what determines whether or not you're in a zone. Because if I'm going to a concert and I'm seeing a group, I'm not judging them on how well they play their songs. They've played their songs a million times. I know you should know these songs backwards and forwards. My thing is, what am I getting that the record is not giving me?
Right. Well, and I think all great performers have that kind of that quality of like, you know, being able to feel like they're speaking directly to you or playing directly to you, but simultaneously also seeming maybe a little bit godlike, you know, a little bit larger than life.
That's funny. It's I've never felt that, because that's why I never wanted to be an artist. I've never wanted to be in front of the camera, because I tend to lose perspective. And my biggest contribution to any artist that I work with would be the fact that I'm not competing for their same space. So for example, I could ride the subway and nobody knows who I am. And that's great, because now I can get a perspective on things. I can hear what people are actually vibing on, what they're actually saying about like certain records or artists or whatever it is, that I get the chance to listen in and see things that most artists can't, because they're too busy being front stage.
Right, and there's a certain level of fame after which, like, no matter how hard you try, you kind of lose touch.
Oh yeah, I mean, it gets to the point where I call it flying at 35,000 feet. It's like you're never touching the ground. It's like the action is on the ground. I never want to lose that perspective. That's why I deliberately craft my life to be devoid of that.
I'm so curious, like how, and I know we have to get to Q&A in a second, but maybe I'll lead it off with one of my cues. Like, how do you stay engaged with, because it's so important to stay engaged with like what the generation behind you, younger than you, is doing, and then younger than them. And like, I already find that, I mean, I'm not that old, but I already find like, oh, I gotta keep my ear to the ground, like figure out what the kids are doing. Like, how do you do that? What's the process?
Well, the one thing, I never grew up. so I don't, you know, it's like I'm always 15, you know, and that's and I'm always I always have that excitement of being 15. I just have the wisdom of being understanding through time as what has transpired. But I throw all of that away, because I could go to a place and appreciate, you know, 7-year-olds playing, because people say, oh, they're not great, they're not good. No, but I want to hear the interaction. I want to see how they are interacting with their instruments and with each other. Are they having fun doing it? Because I could care less if they're destroying the piece. My thing is, if they're having fun doing it, then guess what? I'm going to have fun listening to them.
Yeah.
In some ways, that gets to one of the questions from the audience. This is an amazing conversation, you two. Thank you for everything so far. Check this out. You've danced around this a little bit. What role have accidents or mistakes played in the way that you make or discover new ways of making music, or in music that you've made?
Wow, big question. Timo, you want to grab it, or you want me to jump on it?
Well, I mean, this, I feel like we hinted at this before with the idea of like setting out to make something that you really love, like in that mold, and failing. I really love the music of the minimalist composers. Yeah, Steve Reich, Philip Glass, you know, I could name dozens more, but you know, David Lang. I those guys have been incredibly influential on my work, and I've analyzed and studied their music, and I've had moments where I've said, okay, I really want to make a piece that works like this, maybe looking at a piece of minimal composition. And I always find myself landing somewhere to the left of that. You know, I can't, like somehow my brain is just not wired that way. Like I just have too many things floating around in it, and they make their way into the music. And so I end up with this kind of music that that uses some minimal processes, some of their tools, excuse me, but doesn't sound at all like that. It doesn't have those clean surfaces. It doesn't have the focus. And part of me is like, oh, why can't I do that? Like, why can't I just do it? And another part of me is like, oh, but that's my sound. Like, it has these elements, and then it has all this other stuff, and that's just who I am. So maybe that's okay. But I think that is one example of, you know, accidentally stumbling on something.
It's for me, accidents are like, they happen more often than you get something good. And it's funny. I was listening to a reggae artist, a reggae producer. I think it was King Tubby, and he says, you know, when you make a mistake, do it 3 times. He'll say, do it 3 times, man.
Well, and I mean,
they won't know it's a mistake.
You think about like someone like Thelonious Monk's playing, like. Who can say like how many of those crazy notes that he plays, like who can say like what's necessarily intentional, what's kind of a mistake? But like the mistakes, I was listening to some of his just his solo playing the other day, and like there's something about his wrong notes that's just like indescribably cool sounding.
Yo, you have just hit my heart spot. Yo, it's my favorite jazz pianist of all time. Why?
It's so good, and yeah, and it's so like I don't even have the words to tell you why it's good, but
because he's dissident, he's outside the frame. He's doing everything that you're not supposed to do. He doesn't take himself seriously. These are things that I think that hinders us. It's like we're in the studio and we want to be correct. No, it's the mistakes that makes things great. The things that I look at as a mistake is something that kind of like, it's kind of like when you're watching an actor and they're a rapper that turned actor. And now, are you making me believe that the story is good, or am I feeling I'm at a rap concert? those are the things that to me is what happens in terms of the mistakes. Did the mistake draw so much attention to itself that it distracts you from the piece, or is that mistake adding some consistency and evolution to what you're listening to?
Was it Brian Eno who said the quote, like, honor thy mistake as an intention, as a secret intention, or something like that?
Awesome. I mean, but that to me is what things. And I don't know if you guys got more questions, because I'm seeing a lot of things writing up here. Like, we got 1 more minute or something or other.
Yeah, we
have
a couple of minutes. There's a question about how both of you are just tireless workers. You create so much. What are the ways that you recharge your batteries? What are the ways that you find inspiration when when you're burning the candle at both ends?
Wow. Big question. Big question. Okay, I'll tackle it.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that I do is you gotta have an alternative hobby. Music can't be the only thing that's in your existence.
Mm.
You gotta have, you need an outlet. I don't care what it is. You know, for me, it's sports. You know, I'm not the greatest at it, but I'm gonna play sports because it's the thing that allows me to engage myself into something, but it takes my mind completely off of having to think about anything else but the sport, what I'm engaged in at that moment. And that to me works, you know, and recharging that is important. If that takes a month, I may do sports for a whole month and not do nothing. and a lot of people, you know, can't do that. You gotta constantly stay at it. But for me, if you're not feeling it, stay away from it.
Mm. I mean, I would add to that with, you know, make sure there are people and friends in your life who aren't also musicians and aren't even other artists. I mean, I think it's important to have to spread a wide net in terms of that. I mean, but yeah, the hobbies and interests thing, I think that's really important. And you know, just yeah, you got to know when to call it quits for the day when you've stopped being productive, whether that's you're an instrumentalist and your fingers are still practicing, but your brain is just totally shut down. I mean, you know, go take a walk or something. There are all sorts of ways that I'll take walks during the middle of the day and just sort of like have the music going through my head, and that's often how I'll sort of work through a creative block, something like that. And that does sort of recharge me.
Well, with that, yeah, it may be time to take a walk. We've hit the end.
Sounds good.
We've hit the end of our hour. So Timo Andrus, Hank Shocklee, thank you for just like one of the great conversations of this series and of this whole life that we're living right now. I mean, this I think you just recharged all of our batteries with your words and your kindness and your thoughtfulness. So thank you both.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
You bet. And we have to do this again. We absolutely have to do this again.
Great to talk.
Here, yeah, anytime you need me, all right? And
thank
you very much, Doctor.
All right. So thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you again at the next CoPA conversation.
Bye now.